Hi, everybody. I'm joined today. Yes, it's another interview. I'm doing more and more of those lately, but I'm here today with Professor Christopher Ferguson. He's a professor of psychology at Stetson, and he wanted me to call him a grand poobah as well. And I'm good with this. We like silly titles. But Chris is here to talk about a paper he has published, co-authored, I understand, on Gamergate. And we're just going to jump right in, Chris. Why the heck did you decide to delve back into Gamergate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it came about because of a conference I was at back in November of 2018. I think it was the Clash of Realities conference I was a part of. And there was a lot of talk there about Gamergate and sort of the narrative that kind of spiraled off of it is like gamers as a culture as being sexist and misogynist and having a lot of these types of issues and such. And that got me kind of curious. I mean, of course, I was aware of Gamergate. I sort of followed it back in 2014 when it really kind of erupted and everything. You kind of casually followed it. And what kind of struck me at the conference was this, people were making a lot of definitive statements, about like who Gamergate was, how it was related to gaming and alt-right, and stuff like that. And that got me kind of curious. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice already. That got me kind of curious about, what the empirical, like how many studies have been done, like on Gamergate or Gamergate supporters. And like while I was at the conference, this was in Germany, and while I was at the conference, I looked it up on, we have these databases for academic articles, and I found out two really interesting things. One, Gamergate also refers to ants. So there are ants called, so I did not know that. I had no idea. So this is like a thing. And two, there's like way more research on the ants than there is on the people, which is to say there's like zero, at least at the time, there was zero in like social science articles looking at the Gamergate phenomenon. Other than there were a couple that were like anecdotal, articles, but in terms of like actual empirical articles looking at Gamergate and saying like, here are the people that were involved in this, and this is what their personalities look like, or whatever, anything at all. There was nothing, and so that got me kind of curious about, and of course that's kind of like the thread of my whole academic career is like people are saying this, but here's what the evidence is, or there isn't any evidence. And that always gets me kind of curious about stuff. So that got me curious, looking for any information about any kind of data about Gamergate, like the actual people that were involved, that identified as being Gamergate supporters or whatever. And looking around, I came across some of Brad Glasgow's stuff that he had done. He had done the survey, but it had never been published. And so I got in touch with him and said, hey, seems like you got like an interesting set of data here. What can we do with it? And that's kind of where things went from there.
Yeah, I mean, Brad put it as fundings at the time, and I remember reading it back in 2000. I don't remember 2014, 2015. He put it out, but I remember being pretty impressed with how he controlled for variables. Mm-hmm. But he either got attacked by people who didn't wanna hear it, or he was resoundingly ignored. It was like there was a narrative that was set, and people didn't want to be told otherwise.
Right.
Other than just fact finding, just truth. Mm-hmm. What's the benefit of delving into these sort of public feuds in niche online communities when people's opinions are so set? I mean, you're really trying to slog uphill in the snow backwards on this one. So why did you think that this particular approach was worthy?
Yeah, well, I guess you could ask me in 3 to 6 months if it was worth doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, so that is one thing that has, really sort of struck me is that this is an issue that on both sides, if you will, people have really, really passionate views about, and so I think, even in the article, and, I'd written something for, I forget it was Aereo or some, Quillette might have been Quillette.
Yeah.
I think in both places, I kind of mentioned, like, I'm not even going to try to put together a timeline, because there's no way you're going to remotely satisfy everybody about what the timeline is and who said what to when, this kind of stuff. And just, people just have really, really passionate ideas about what happened exactly. I mean, there are some like broad strokes everybody will kind of agree on, maybe. Yeah, so it has struck me. This is like, like I said, it's a very niche issue. I mean, it got some national attention at the time. But for the most part, it's kind of a niche issue. But within that niche, people have very, very passionate views about that. So I mean, and part of that is kind of what interests me. So I get involved in other things. Obviously, that's what got me started with gaming research in the first place, where there was more of the sort of conservative side that were worried about games, and now it seems to be sort of more the liberal side or progressive side that's worried about the Gamergate stuff. And even some other areas. Again, I do a little bit of spanking research, just because I'm sort of interested. As another area where people have very passionate views on both sides and stuff. So I'm sort of interested in these debates where there are these, like you said, there are these narratives that form, and people are very wedded to these narratives, and they're very, concrete and acrimonious almost. People on the different sides of these narratives like loathe each other, and I always have this idea that, like, it's helpful to bring actual data to the table, and our article is just one, and hopefully, if anything, it will spur other people to look at the same issue, maybe in different ways, maybe in better ways than we did, to get more data. Because what kind of bothers me now, whatever the truth is, the platonic truth or whatever, is that there are these, people are saying definitive fact-based things with like literally no data, because there just is no peer-reviewed data at any rate. So I think there's always some benefit in bringing data to the table, but with the realization that, I mean, if you look at like violence in video games, I mean, I've been involved in that since the early 2000s, and I would say I've seen a gradual progression and what I would think of as being a positive, more database direction over 15 years, I'd say is probably about right. So it's a long-term process. So I don't think anybody's going to think that, well, we're going to publish one paper that's largely, self-report survey demographic kind of stuff. That's going to change everybody's views. It's not, but it's, one piece of data that hopefully will get other scholars to do, I mean, like I said, improve upon what we did. Maybe they get different results. That's fine. And then we can get a clearer picture, perhaps, of like, if we're interested in Gamergate supporters for real, like who are these individuals, and do their characteristics really kind of fit the narrative that emerged around them?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, as a journalist, I was going, hey, this is more complicated than, they're a vile hive of misogynists and racists and alt-right types. I spent a lot of time talking to them, and all it did was get me ostracized from gaming community circles. People to this day won't talk to me, won't run my stuff, and make really odd excuses for it. Now, one of the theories is that, of course, no journalist likes to be the story. That was a huge problem I got into with Gamergate when Milo Yiannopoulos went after me, and all of a sudden I was the story instead of being somebody covering the story.
Right.
In terms of the psychology of these public feuds, can the media, individual media as people, I mean, I knew a lot of men on the gaming media side who had their letters of resignation in their desk. They were so stressed. Everybody was getting bombarded. Everybody was being called horrible stuff. People's families were getting threatened. It was, it was a full-blown onslaught on games journalism. But what got covered was the harassment of women. I started, and I don't want to armchair psychologize around you. I'm wondering if there's something that can explain this apparent phenomenon I've observed anecdotally about men aren't willing to talk about, male reporters weren't willing to talk about their own experiences. Instead, they were writing articles on behalf of women.
Well, I think there's the sense that you get kind of a moral snowball effect, right? And people want to be on the right side of, and we hear this with, this isn't anything remotely unique to this particular issue. I mean, you can look at like everything people argue about on Twitter, which is like a bazillion absurd things and like a dozen important things,
Right.
and on all of these things, you'll see that comment like with Trump, for a president of the United States here, I think, the sense you need to be on the right side of history. And both sides think they're on the right side of history, so you can't ever win, so, and I'll be upfront and say I'm not a fan of our president by any means, but there is a sense of like trying to get people to morally, step into line, in the
Right.
sense that you need to say a certain set of things, and there's this, ideological moral position. And if you do anything to question it, you become an ist, a sexist or racist, whatever that may be. So it's a very, very powerful, in all those words. I mean, most of us, we're all human beings, but most of us don't want to think we're an ist.
Right.
Of any sort, you know what I mean? And so once people start saying that, your comment is, racist, sexist, whatever it might is, Islamophobic, whatever, that's a very, very powerful disincentive to keep speaking, so it's kind of like the social censorship, sort of approach. And even if those statements are made in good faith, they're not like, really trying to put down an entire group, but they're questioning perhaps an ideology. It's very, very powerful to and that's particularly perhaps true if you're like, like I said, in this issue of Gamergate, if you're a male, nobody wants to hear that you're stressed because of the harassment you're getting, over this issue, because it's, and that's, I think, sometimes fair. We don't want to, that was an issue about harassment about women. And, obviously it really opened, I think, a lot of eyes to some things that really were going on. So maybe there's a fair sense of, well, maybe my problems were not as big, and I don't want to make it all about me, where it's already been all about me, historically. But on the other hand, I think there is that sense of like, it's probably okay to have a more nuanced discussion about these things. And that seems to have become more difficult over the past decade or so on a lot of issues. People don't want the nuance. In fact, you're a bad person if you bring in any kind of nuance, or at least that's sort of the message people get. And so I mean, I think it's just a cultural shift we've been experiencing to this hyperpolarization on pretty much everything. I mean, you can find like, on Twitter, like people arguing about like young adult novels and knitting and all kinds of other crazy stuff, like incredibly polarizing, politically correct, whatever words we want to use, kind of way. So it just seems to be something, whether that's like social media's fault or just something else was happening, or Trump's fault. I mean, I don't think it's any one thing, but we really seem to have gotten to a culture where my virtue depends upon bashing you as hard as I possibly can in the meanest, smuggest way possible. And that's how I show how virtuous I am to whatever tribe. But and both the left and the right do this. But it makes, having like actual intelligent conversations very difficult, because that requires nuance and things like compromise and trying to understand different people and not make it all about, me or
Right.
you or so we have to really open up dialogue, and that's really hard to do these days.
Yeah, one of the nuances that I noticed you touched briefly on in your paper was that the difference between tactics when people went after someone and the motivation for choosing that target. And I think that got, to put that in sort of simpler terms, fifth grade reading level terms, people came after me and said sexist and anti-Semitic things. They did not target me because I was a woman or Jewish. They targeted me because I was a journalist and was just saying nasty stuff they thought would hurt.
Right.
Now, from a psychological background, does that nuance matter? Does the question of whether someone has bigoted intents or just emulating bigoted language, is that meaningful? Is that significant?
Yeah, I think it is, if we're trying to understand the person doing it. I mean, it might not always necessarily be that meaningful for the person receiving it. It may be equally traumatic or stressful, whatever, for the person who's on the receiving end of that, because they might not, there's no way that they can know, particularly if it's a death threat or a rape threat or something of that sort. How do you know if the person's serious or just trying to push your buttons or intimidate you and whatever? So that's part of what makes these comments so successful in intimidating other individuals. But in terms of like trying to understand, who's doing this and why, I think it is helpful to understand that. So, I mean, there is obviously a segment of individuals out there in the world who really are like hyper racist, hyper sexist, horrible human beings. There are Nazis in the world. I don't think there are many, but there are some. There's no doubt about that. So, we certainly have to allow that there are some horrible human beings who are ideologically horrible. They really believe in worldviews that most of us would think are like absurd, absurd and just terrible. But they're also just jackasses, right? Who are just, they don't really have any ideological position on anything other than to be a dick. And in some cases, even with them, there's a breakdown of those who really are like angry at you for whatever reason. You've said something and they're angry at you, and they want to shut you up by being a big asshole,
Right.
saying mean things and intimidating you, threatening you, whatever. They really might not be an ideological fascist or whatever, but they just want to, they're not anti-Semitic, but they know that picking on that will intimidate you. And then there's also a group that don't even give a shit about the issue. They just they saw your name somewhere, and for the lulz of it, they're just gonna they'd have it's a slow Friday, so they don't have much else going on. So why not troll some, random person for the sake of doing that? And that was always kind of the thing that like dissatisfied me about the Gamergate narrative, even back in like 2014 or so when it first started getting attention. I would say back then I probably was pretty, fairly solidly on the side of being alarmed and concerned. I mean, I'm obviously still concerned about harassment in any capacity, but I kind of bought the narrative, I think, put it that way. But even then, I think I had a sense of like, well, we don't really know that these are gamers. These are just random people. These are like literally anonymous people on Twitter that are using a hashtag that anybody can use. So we don't know that they're really Gamergate supporters. If we're thinking about like the ethics and journalism issue, we don't know if they're gamers. We don't know if they give a shit about these issues at all. They could be just random, trolls. It's conceivably possible that they're anti-Gamergaters who are just like, publishing hateful things in order to make their own, it's sort of like the firefighters who set fires, you know what I mean, to put them out, kind of a thing. I'm not saying that is what happened. What I'm saying is we don't know.
Yeah, we can't rule it out.
Yeah, we don't know who the individuals are that were doing it. And there was this FBI investigation that satisfied nobody at all. That I think they just found a handful of individuals who were the worst offenders or something of that sort. But a lot of it was redacted. So, we don't fully understand what they, what kind of conclusions they came to. But, I mean, but, there again, that's the sort of thing that makes me a little bit uncomfortable is a sense of like, narratives forming without information, and that's not to say that the issue wasn't an important one. It is, and it still is, that we should all do what we can to stop harassment of women and girls in gaming, or anywhere, and, perhaps even push for trying to like generally discourage people from being harassing towards anyone. But like I said, a narrative kind of formed and crystallized around a particular worldview. And that seems to have, even though it's getting less attention in national news, it seems to have gotten worse in the sense of like tying it to like the alt-right and then Nazis like trolling for kids online. It's starting to sound like the Satan, heavy metal stuff in the 80s a little bit. So, these narratives that form with that information always made me like weirdly uncomfortable. So I was hoping to bring a little bit of data to shine onto some of that. Certainly it's imperfect data, but it's the first actual piece that's been peer reviewed, I think.
Okay.
So hopefully that's useful.
Now, how do you prepare? You talk about those people just wanting to be jerks, just fling. You're out there on social media in a way that a lot of academics aren't. Because quite frankly, a lot of academics cannot handle the stress of social media. And I've seen some of the very, I would say, this is just my opinion, poorly argued and irrelevant mudslinging that comes your way And to me, they're focused on things that are not terribly important, but things like the attacks on the Quillette publication. People seem to have very strong opinions on that. Yeah. Two-part question. Why do you choose to communicate in this way as opposed to just sticking to respected, academic journals? And how do you insulate yourself against the psychological impacts of that sort of online nastiness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think it is important to try to communicate with the general public. I mean, science isn't really super useful if nobody ever hears about it, right? And nobody in the general public is going to read it. Well, I mean, very few people, are going to read a scientific journal. Some will. I mean, there's some science geeks out there, and that's great. But the readership, I always kind of joke, like, the readership of any one of my scientific articles is maybe, if I'm lucky, a couple dozen people. You know what I mean? So it's really not going to have a huge, impact on the world as the reality of it. And so I think there's some value, particularly for like a hot button kind of an issue, to try to bring that to the general public. And then I think that, I mean, it's, particularly Twitter is the worst, right? So people on Twitter are unfiltered. I put it that way. Sometimes, I don't know what you get it on Facebook and other places too, but something about Twitter. It's just like, that's just the way it is. So I mean, they're it's not pleasant to engage in a conversation with someone who's decided that they're just gonna be a dick, what I mean? And that's not to say that, again, my experiences are anything remotely near what some of the women in this like Anita Sarkeesian and others experience in this situation. But I think at that level, I mean, I still like, you could point on the street and say, hey, that's Chris Ferguson, and nobody's gonna know who the hell I am. So a pretty small fish, but some of it, I think, at least this far, is just trying to figure out like when a conversation is useful to continue engaging in, and then stepping out of it when it's not, And I'm not always perfect at that, so I'm not.
Nobody is. Yeah.
Say, like, oh, go through all my Twitter things. Just say I'm a perfect. No. I mean, there are times when I get drawn in and baited and all that kind of stuff too, and say things that I probably would be embarrassed, by, at this point, but. I try, to try to figure out when someone is worth engaging with. And sometimes they are, and end up conversation with someone who disagrees with you. Try to be respectful. I mean, again, I'm not perfect, and I've been snarky with people, and I don't live up to my own, beliefs sometimes. But but trying to, usually I kind of say like, okay, well, have a nice. If I'll say, I wished you a nice day, and that's usually where I've decided that I'm done. And it's not really worthwhile necessarily, anymore. But I mean, it's easy for me to say, but trying to figure out when to unplug and when to engage is the trick of it. But it's funny. I mean, sometimes you do see it over the gaming issues and whatever, but I occasionally, because I like to discourse on controversial things anyway, for the sake of it. Sometimes it's interesting, and I think where I've had the worst experiences was when I tried to like, let's have a debate about like this hot button issue. Not something I don't have any expertise in. And I'm just like, I'm thinking about this. This is what I think. How do you all feel about it? And that usually ends in disaster. What I mean? Then I did it. I mean, I'll share with you. I did it once on like the abortion debate, which is not, I just was musing about it and sort of like the meaning of life for like unborn fetuses, whatever. I don't have a strong, it's not like one of my issues I have a strong opinion on one way or the other, which maybe was my mistake. Because I didn't really want to engage in a nasty conversation over it, but I kind of said essentially I can see both sides' points, and I kind of became synonymously a sexist and a baby killer. So there's that sense of like trying to like walk a middle ground is like the worst. You don't even have a tribe at that point. You just made everybody mad. So I've avoided those.
That was my experience in Gamergate. Is suddenly I didn't have a tribe anymore. Everybody was like, "Oh, you're secretly pro Gamergate, secretly anti Gamergate," and I'm like, "How can someone secretively use a hashtag?" Like, I don't. There's this weird idea that if you even talk to somebody in a remotely civil way that has a different view from you, you're not to be trusted.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that there's an element of financial insecurity, but there's a lot of identity-based insecurity going on right now. I mean, one of the things I realized in this whole thing and following your stuff is I don't identify with my gender as strongly as a lot of people do. And that was a real wake-up call.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that really touched people off at the beginning, because there's sort of this like pre-Gamergate period from like the spring of 2014 to, you know, I think it was late August when all those articles came out at the same time, you know, in the 48-hour news cycle after a Tropes versus Women video came out. And all these conspiracy theories went crazy, but it was the direct attack on the gamer identity that I personally thought from a community perspective, some of those articles were profoundly irresponsible. I don't know how a professional outlet lets through those sorts of ad hominems on an entire community. I mean, if someone said women are this, or the female identity is that, or black people are this, we'd see it for what it is.
Right.
But this this idea that gamer is synonymous with white men, even though 2 of the 3 main console companies are Japanese,
Right.
it seems to have created this blind spot in people that it's okay to fling pejoratives or nastiness at any group because it's the wrong group. What did you with your greater research into video games, how have you found that sort of contributed to the misconceptions? Or I don't want to ask too leading a question here, so I'll just give you the floor here to answer what you think is relevant on this identity point.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, I mean, we know that there's been the sort of stereotyping of gamers that have gone back, you know, to at least the 90s and probably earlier, and it's kind of the same stereotype as the sort of like white male, young, socially incompetent, in the basement with the shades drawn, overweight, unhealthy, you know, kind of a, you know, angry, but like in a passive way, you know, passive aggressive sort of individual. You know, and that's kind of still, you know, so, you know, back in like the 90s and aughts, if you will, it was mostly like older adults who had that stereotype, you know, so it was kind of like, again, more of a conservative view, you know, that,
focus on the family and stuff. We're putting up pamphlets.
Exactly. A lot of that stuff. And so I think, which was kind of fascinating ways, we're starting to see that like literally die off. I mean, I mean that in a like literal sense of like the people that believe that are dying, you know. So there is this kind of like generational shift. As the average person sort of has grown up with video games, we're now seeing less of that sort of like, there's still some of it. You know, I don't want to make it like sound like entirely Pollyannish. And of course, you know, our president, you know, Trump is sometimes referred to games after mass shootings and stuff. So I don't want to make it sound like it's, you know,
but so is Joe Biden. So it's not a politically partisan issue in that regard.
Joe Biden's weird when it comes to video games. That's a whole other, you know, I met him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, me and a bunch of it wasn't like we were sitting down having coffee or anything, but, you know, I was part of a meeting that he had held after the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012, so I did get to meet. I'm sure he doesn't remember, but
you were part of that meeting.
I was part of that meeting. Yeah.
Oh,
I even told him he was wrong.
The little creeps meeting, or no, that was a different meeting.
No, I think that was a different meeting. Although the little creeps were there, you know, so it was some of the executives of the different video game companies, and then there were some scholars in the room, helping one of them in the room as well. And he was actually, I mean, in that meeting, he was actually pretty good, you know, in terms of like not really being that interested in video games. But at one point he said something like youth violence is going up, and I actually stopped and corrected him.
It's not.
Said, no, it's not. You're, you know, I basically said you're wrong about that. And I was waiting for my IRS audit for years after telling him.
It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. Although it might, if he gets elected, I might have to get nervous again. So particularly if he remembers. But anyway, So
that's a
yeah,
weird one though, because of all people he should know, he has been on so many task force and he has been engaged in this issue for so many years, and still and he says so many things that just are not based in facts. And I don't want to do, well, Trump does too, but we expect better from Biden. We kind of do, but it's almost like I get cynical on this, that it's like, let's face it, the Democratic base is suburban, college-educated women, Black African-American women, and then college-educated white women. That's the base. And it's almost like they don't want to go against the pre-existing biases of that base by saying, oh, video games are okay. Am I just spitballing here, or is there something to that?
Well, I mean, I think, Biden in particular has a reputation for sort of opening his mouth and putting his foot in it,
Right.
which is part of his charm almost in a way, although
You'd think he'd love gamers though, based on that attack.
Well, he's old, he's old, so I don't think he cares about gaming in the way that, some other people, like Hillary Clinton, made it an actual issue. I don't think he cares about it in the way that she did back in 2005.
Yeah.
Clearly. But my impression of him is it's the Joe Biden show. You know what I mean? Like and so I think like his little creeps comment can kind of be put into that context of like people not agreeing with it, was just by no means unique to Biden. I mean, this is like a politician thing, right? But people weren't agreeing with what he wanted them to agree to, and so he gets sort of negative about it. So I think that's probably the basis of the little creeps comment.
He was wedging one group against another group to score political points with the people who were right in front of him. That's probably what I took from that comment.
Yeah. I think there's some of that. I don't think he cares a lot about video games one way or the other, but so I think he would throw them under the bus if it suited him, but I think he would not not ideologically make it an issue the way that some politicians have made it. But no, but so kind of going back to your original question, it is a fascinating way to see that there's this like now this progressive faction, and particularly within games journalism, that seems really anti-game, which is sort of. And it's not all games journalism. I don't want to paint with a broad brush. I love Game Informer. They're a great magazine, but they only do reviews mostly, right. So that's okay. Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of that comes from the humanities and maybe social science. There's a whole like critical theory kind of approach to like deconstructing everything.
The sociology route kind of thing. Yeah,
even just like. Obviously it's not exactly English, but it's like the sort of literature-ish kind of stuff where you take
cultural studies
yeah. Stuff. So I think a lot of that has come out of that, which in my impression is a fairly ideological view of the world that does sort of separate. It's the kind of like the intersectionality sort of thing, which has some points, but also kind of has this tendency to put people into boxes of good and bad. And based on identity, which is sort of weird, race and gender and stuff like that. So, and I think that's crept into games journalism, which is where you're seeing all these, like what I think is kind of like strange articles for games journalism that seem like really anti-game, anti-gamer, which would, I mean, I don't get it. I mean, maybe this is working for them and they're profiting mightily. I don't know, but I would think that would be like the complete opposite of just knowing your audience.